Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Welcome. My name is Adrienne, and I'm delighted to moderate today's panel, Race and Racism in Austen Spaces. All four of our panelists today authored essays focused on this topic in the fall 2021 special issues volume of ABO, Interactive Journal for Women in the Arts, 1640 to 1830. As I read the essays, I found myself audibly exclaiming yes to so many of the observations, research, and analysis that each of you made within your essay. The essays are publicly available online and can be accessed by our viewers. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from all of you today. So let me introduce our panelists. Social media mage by day and nerd of many fandoms by night, Bianca Hernandez Knight is a lady of many interests. From fighting for a more inclusive Jane Austen community to ignoring her TBR pile, she is always ready for her next nerdy project. Amanda Ray Prescott is a Black and multiracial freelance pop culture journalist from New York City, specializing in covering period dramas and UK television. Dr. Kerry Sinanan is associate professor in English at UTSA, where she specializes in the Black Atlantic race and slavery in the 18th century and 19th centuries. Trey Venter Griffiths is a public historian of Black British history. While he works as a poet, he has also written for journalism, poetry zines, and academic publications. He has an MA in race, education, and decolonial thought from Leeds Beckett University and will be starting a PhD program in October with Kingston University, researching the Windrush generation in his community in Northamptonshire. Despite having vested interest in academia, Trey does a lot of work in his community, going into schools and helping other organizations, including social action groups with grassroots events. He is a practitioner academic, being an associate lecturer in criminology while lending a hand when his community needs him too. Thank you all of us for being with us today. As a reminder to our viewers, we will be abiding by the virtual GenCon community guidelines in regards to language and content. So let's get started. First, I want to talk about how this sort of cluster of essays came about. In Kerry's introduction to the cluster, she wrote that this is the first cluster focused on this topic, authored entirely by writers of the global majority. How did this cluster come about? What were the conversations that led up to it?
Thank you so much, Adrienne. And I just want to express my enormous gratitude, first of all, to my co-writers here, who I'm delighted, just honored to be in community with. And it was really that community, you know, us chatting regularly about Austen issues, social media issues arising out of adaptations and period dramas, and just having made some connections. And we were really looking for a space. Persuasions had brought out a diversities, a volume, a special issue on diversity in Jane Austen. And we really felt that there was a lot more to say than maybe one issue would allow, and that there were more voices to be included than might be included in that volume. And one of the things I've been very aware of as somebody within academia and as also a sort of lover of Jane Austen, although albeit a very critical lover of Jane Austen, one thing I've always been aware of is the unnecessary dividing line between academic Austenites and Austenites in the world. And I think it's a false line because there's so much crossover, but I also think increasingly now in the age of social media and adaptation that we in academia have to really listen to people like Amanda, Trey, and Bianca, who are in fact experts in these other spaces and are understanding the ways in which patterns of systemic racism are not only persisting, but are being given sort of fodder to grow and burgeon. And that's of deep concern to me, because again, it's not a boundary that's stable. I'll get students into my classroom who have maybe come through the Bridgerton route and want to encounter Jane Austen through specific lenses, or have come, you know, from it used to be the Keira Knightley, you can all correct me with my dates and adaptations, that they came in and expecting certain versions of Austen. And then when I'm teaching Austen on a course that really is mostly about slavery and race, I need to deal with their sense of Austen that they've got in these different spaces. So we all need to be listening to people like Bianca, Trey, and Amanda, and we all need to be very aware of the way in which Austen spaces, you know, huge societies like Jasna, publications like Persuasions can be, not always, but can be weighted against voices that are more critical of the whiteness that persists in Austen studies. So I think that was how it really came together, and we felt there was a sort of a critical tipping point last year where we really had stuff to say, and I'll pass it over to everybody else.
For me, my participation in this collection came about because I submitted my essay to Persuasions and they rejected it. Some of the feedback I got was rightfully critical of the fact that I am not an academic by trade. I'm a journalist, so the way I would cite things, the way I would structure my argument was based on a more reading for the general audience versus how an academic would phrase things. But I also believe some of the feedback I received was not helpful to my work and study because they were viewing what I do solely from an academic lens and did not see the need, or they didn't see the need or how I'm understanding the topic versus the way they would express it. There was an essay on my topic that was submitted to the essay collection that it was a good treatment of the topic, but only approached the issue from a solely academic lens. It did not include as much of the critique of fandom that I wanted to see in my essay. So that's why I wrote my essay, because I realized so much of the social media discussion was left out of their it was a good essay, but it was also kind of half the story. I wish both of our essays run together. That way the audience have a complete picture of the topic. So that's why I participated in this collection.
Trey or Bianca, do you want to add to that? I know academic publishing and publishing for journalism is a lot different, or blog posting or all that. And so that process may have been a little bit different for either of you.
I think with my essay as well, like I also submitted originally to Jasna's Persuasions, and I also come from a more academic background, but I have also written for journalism too. And though my essay was written for public audiences, I did use some terms that were more known in academia. And so, for example, I was using terms like epistemic violence, which is violence through knowledge production. And anybody who's been to university and done subjects like sociology, psychology, or any form of like research methods module would have come across terms like epistemology. And when I used terms like that in my essay, I was told that it was sort of being purposely inflammatory, I guess, which was a huge red flag for me. I was also using terms like white supremacy, which was also told. I was also told that was being an inflammatory term. But when you do look at how Austen fandom operates, it is a culture that fundamentally centers the views of white people and emotions over those who are not white. So white supremacy, I think me and Amanda did actually dodge a bullet there by not being published in that Jasna publication. At the same time, that does show how whiteness does sort of center itself within these circles. Even when those saying this, we're inclusive, but obviously you're not that inclusive, are you? So yeah, I think I'll pass on to Bianca. I think she's put more to say on that. Yeah.
So I was not going to submit to that issue for many reasons. I've been a journalist for a long time, but I've also I have a master's. I've done some intense academic stuff in my life. The feedback, I personally feel like the feedback that I saw for writers of color that got rejected was showing discomfort from, and I totally have people on Twitter who are like, that's the peer review process. I'm like, no. This is not just peer review. This is showing some discomfort. And I'd already had issues. Jasna, people not known. I've been boycotting Jesna for a second now, because they really haven't done anything of substance to address their internal racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, bigotry of all levels internally. There are multiple cases that have not been addressed. And they're hypocritical when you do try to get them to address anything. But that's a whole different story. But I agree. I think that, like, should y'all have been published there, because it would have gone to a specific readership that would have also been uncomfortable with you saying, quote, inflammatory, aka real shit about how racism is interacting with their space. I think that's what they didn't want. I think my experience with that org and people around that is that they really want to protect this, like, idea that they're having this, like, intense academic talk, but it's a glorified Sunday brunch session. And I'm going to be controversial to say that. But that's what a lot of it is. And I think that making folks of that, like, we know this from interacting in our daily lives, when you make those folks uncomfortable, they're going to come for you. And I think too, the essays that we have here talk in that vein about how this isn't just a thing of the past that we're discussing. It's not a thing that's centered. It's now. It's happening right now. And I think that us going to ABO almost gave us a kind of, not self-moderation, but it did give us, I feel like, much more control over who is going to be receiving this and in what context. And I think that's really critical. And I'm going to say this as a journalist. This is something that's also really critical in journalism. It is taking care of your reporters, taking care of the communities that are being centered in your writing, and being considerate to that. And that is not a thing of the past. Like, we are currently talking about that and have been for a second in the mass media space. And I think that us being aware of our social media places and centering, kind of understanding this is where this is going to live and interact and be in conversation, is very different than maybe the kind of traditional academic publishing. But I think too, that shows this, like, void of understanding, because thinking that your work kind of exists in this print thing or on a website and that's kind of it, and not understanding where your stuff's going to be engaged is a problem, which is the interesting thing, because I think all of us do touch on this modern audience, the modern, like, how we are engaging and interacting with content. And because of that, we knew how ours would be engaged with. So we could know, like, when to set up, like, firewalls and when to, like, be on support for each other. And I think that's really important. All I'd say, I guess, like, there were many reasons that this came together, but I think the first and foremost was that, like, these were necessary things to be talked about. I think that knowing your audience and knowing your platform and knowing where something is going to do the best work for its topic matter is a second part of that. And I think this came together in a way that was different, but it was really fulfilling. And I feel like also, again, like, us being able to have some power and control over that when it's so sensitive and could come for us personally was really critical. And I hadn't seen this really happen the same way before.
In some ways, it sounds to me that everyone's backgrounds, both in terms of their lived experience, but also their professional backgrounds, as operating in journalism or in the fandom culture, is a strength in this, in producing a work that ends up in a scholarly journal. It becomes a point of power at that point that other people are not bringing to the table. Kerry, you wanted to add something to that.
I just wanted to say that also ABO, we wanted to say thank you to them for I think there was an active decision on the ABO team to create a space for this conversation after it had somewhat been excised. And I think that shows it's a wonderful that they've now created the clusters space, which is what we publish in, as a, yes, it's a traditional academic journal, but I think this is an online open access academic journal that wants to stretch to a different audience. And that's really wonderful too, as Bianca's saying, and is allowing the clusters space as, a slightly more informal, whatever that, I really worry about these lines between academic and journalistic writing, because I don't see those clear-cut lines myself, especially when we think of sociology and history. Like, even within disciplines, we talk in very different ways. And I just think, academia needs to respect professionalism in other areas a lot more. And the language, as Amanda is saying, the language of that profession, that this is not the wrong way to say something. This is actually the right way to name things. So I think we're all grateful for ABO for opening up that space. And as Bianca said, for us to be able to create a degree of safety. And we just want to say thank you to Kate Osmond, Mona Narain, and the other editors for backing us up. We haven't had the backlash that we thought we would get to the degree, which is really interesting, especially given that the essays collectively have had well over 2,000 downloads just since December, which is phenomenal. I never imagined anything I'd written being read in that widely. So I think that's very telling, and I think it's also indicative of a willingness, actually, on the optimistic side. The gatekeeping has been blocking out these conversations that I think people really want to have.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think the conversations online have been mostly like, yes, finally someone is talking about this in this space, and people have been really enthusiastic about it. And as we talk about the content of the actual essays, which those interested can access them online, let's talk about why all of you chose your topics. Bianca, why did you choose to focus on the connection between Heyer, Regency romance, and Austen?
Oh my God, because I feel like I was always having this conversation and now I just can send people a link to this. I truly feel like I've had to have this conversation so many times with academic folks or people that are consider themselves a more academic fan, where they would shit on romance. They would just shit all over Regency romance and all those things, but they would hold Heyer in this very protected high regard, and I'm just like, no. So that's like honestly where it came from, where I'm just like, let's have the conversation then. I want to plot this out. And then literally like after the deadline was when the Venetia special edition got announced, and when Stephen Fry's intro got posted. And so I just had to rewrite a bunch of it after it was already submitted to include that, because that's literally what this is. We live in a space where people are going to romanticize Georgette Heyer, even though she was anti-Semitic in a time where anti-Semitism was a no problem. Like that wasn't of her time, bullshit. And but she's the grandmother of Regency romance. So if we're gonna throw Regency romance out, let's also understand what's wrong with her, and how that was set up, but also these things can talk to each other. And again, it's, Kerry's point of like, students are going to be coming in having been exposed to that. Bridgerton is just one flavor of Regency romance. Romance is it is statistically, even in times of financial problems, the highest selling genre. It has been belittled for a long time. And I'm like, whether or not you like it, if you're working in these spaces, a lot of your readers are coming to you through these lenses. And so, yeah, I wanted to be able to just be like, I'm just going to link to you this whole argument because I'm tired of having to repeat myself.
That's great. And I think too, around that time, there's always a conversation of providing context for readers and the way in which a lot of this has been like decontextualized. So I was not familiar with I was not familiar with her work, and I was not familiar with some of the issues, but I would be appalled to come across some of the anti-Semitism in that if I were reading, and if someone uncritically recommended that to me, like just as a reader. And I think it's also, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what happened to me. As a reader, people were like, you need to read Heyer. Like Jane Austen folks, like Jane Austen Book Club Jasmine folks would be like, you need to read Heyer. She's so good. And also there's a lot of popularity around her audiobooks because Richard Armitage reads them.
Yeah, it's explicitly the Austen thing, for Austenites to be aware. It's the proximity which Stephen Fry makes, as Bianca points out, that she's like Austen, or she's Austen's heir, and that's what's really concerning, because what does that mean?
Mm-hmm. And that she is being brought into the classics kind of space. Like, let's put her on the shelf beside Austen, but again, not contextualize, not kind of pull out and say, what's the reality of this? There's something very suspect about her work getting abridged.
Right. And
it's funny.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Sorry to jump in here. In my work in pop culture journalism, a lot of people are like, why doesn't Masterpiece or PBS or whoever adapt Heyer? And I'm like, slow your roll. This her writings, they have to probably destroy it to get rid of the anti-Semitism and racism and everything else in there that's a problem. And nobody's touching that for 20-foot pole. They don't understand why. And I'm like, well, here's Bianca's essay. It's right there. Because I think a lot of times people bring up hair too as an anti-Bridgerton thing, which is essentially a dog whistle for that's the wrong kind of approach to Regency romance, i.e. wrong, i.e. being vaguely anti-racist. Even though how anti-racist Bridgerton can be is debated, but in the perception of white audiences, that's the wrong kind of Regency romance. So they put hair there because they expect a hair adaptation to have no people of color in it. Those connections, I think a lot of people fail to see when they're bringing up this topic in these spaces.
Yeah, and as we talk about sort of the context surrounding hair, and then also we have Kerry who discussed the decontextualization of Austen heroes and who are actively involved in colonialism. And so Kerry, why did you decide to write about that in this collection?
Well, I've been, as a colonized woman, I lapped up my Jane Austen and my Charlotte Bronte and my Emily and Anne, but with, pleasure from the age of 11 on. I love reading those novels. I think they're all amazing novels, but I've always had a particular, when I read White Sargasso's Sea, I was like, yes, that's what's been making me feel so uncomfortable. Or when I read I Tituba or Windward Heights, by all the rewrites of these novels, I'm like, yes, these are, as much as these are amazing pieces of literature, they are rooted and perpetuate white supremacy. And my academic work, I'm finishing a book on the journals of enslavers and captains' journals. So people might be familiar with, for example, John Newton, who founded the evangelical movement in England, author of Amazing Grace. So Amazing Grace, John Newton was a slave ship captain, conducted 3 slave trading voyages. Then he left slave trading and he became a reverend, and really was a huge figure in founding evangelicalism. He was very good friends with Hannah More, who Jane Austen very much respected. And there's a story that Jane Austen was in the area and went to visit Hannah More at her house one day, but Hannah More was out. So I don't think she ever got to meet Hannah More. But I'm sure Jane Austen would have been reading the kind of literature that John Newton was publishing, Letters of the Heart, Cardiphonia, letters to his wife, the Olney hymns written with William Cowper, who was Austen's favorite poet. And so these connections, so John Newton now becomes a good man. He then becomes, with Cooper, his friend, an abolitionist. He probably knew Olaudah Equiano, who was one of the Sons of Africa, who self-penned his own autobiography, and he did become an abolitionist. But one of the things I really want to hammer home to people is that abolitionism is not anti-racism. Most, if not all, British abolitionists and North American abolitionists did not think of their Black brothers and sisters, if we think of the Wedgwood Medallion petitioning, but they did not really think of them as equal. And many of them make that argument, we must free our Black brothers and sisters in the colonies, but are they ready for their freedom? And so that's always been my point. And, we think of figures like Darcy as, again, rooted in the Cinderella myth. And if we're paying attention to that, one thing, again, as somebody who's hungry for, non-academic reading in my off time, one thing I just keep noticing is that even contemporary white romance is still fundamentally about capital acquisition. The myth in white romance is that you cannot really be happy unless you end up wealthy and with houses and pools and access to leisure time. And that's the fulfillment of the dream. And so the intertwining of romance with materiality, which we see very much in Austen. Yes, we all want to be Lizzie Bennet. We want Lizzie to get Pemberley. We feel her feelings when she looks at Pemberley and she thinks, I could have been the mistress of this. I think she means it, since she's not joking. It's like, maybe I should have given that a second thought. How strong is my dislike really? And I think that is important for us to think through, because the wealth of that period comes as trade, argues in many of his pieces comes from the blood and labor of, Indigenous genocide and mass enslavement, and the Black Atlantic, the Middle Passage. And nobody, still in my field of 18th century, nobody particularly wants to brush the gloss off and have a little bit of a look. Aimé Césaire, the decolonial writer, talks about the blood seeping through the cracks of the buildings of colonialism. And I feel that's something that we might need to do in Austen studies, is look at, as much as it's uncomfortable for many of us, to look at the blood that's seeping through the cracks of the Pemberleys and the Mansfield Parks. And I mean, this is the thing, I think this is also led by Austen. She gives us Sir Thomas Bertram, a deeply problematic, not likable despot of some degree, who has to physically go back to Antigua and look at his plantations. And that's been written about quite a lot. So I really wanted to take it to the less obvious figures. Darcy is set up as the good man of Austen. And what does that mean culturally? What does it mean for white supremacy? What does it mean for romance plots, which it continues being considered to be hugely profitable, hugely popular, and this is the thing about romance, potentially a site of liberation and inclusivity, or potentially a site of the perpetuation of really damaging myths. So I thought, if I can really talk about Darcy, who would never readily be associated with slavery or colonialism or rapacious greed, he's set up, if I can really show that actually it is connected, that would be an important argument to make.
Yeah, and I see, I really like how you say that Austen invites us into this, right? Invites us to look deeply into this. So it's not opposite Austen. It's not something we can't talk about, because it's part of all of it. And I think, Trey, in your articles, you also, in your essay, you also talk about the way that this is part of the UK National Trust and about the history. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, unlike the other three authors here, like I'm based in the UK, where Austen was living and was writing about, and I'm having to stick British colonial statues in the face every time I go to London. October 2020, I was in Edinburgh as well, and at Edinburgh there's statues of back to slavery. But then the National Trust report was published in September 2020. Into their links with colonialism and slavery. And then I was sort of thinking around reading Austen and the sorts of buildings she talks about and her characters live in, but we're not actually told how her characters made their wealth. It's sort of if they get their money and they pluck it off trees in a way, and it comes out of nowhere. And teaching criminology as well. So that side of me sort of looked at the National Trust report as a site of sort of critiquing violence, but also capitalism as well. And then I basically went down a Black Lives Matter rabbit hole in terms of anti-racism and capitalism, and a number of people that I know who want to be anti-racist, but then they won't commit to anti-capitalism as well. So the UK National Trust report, co-authored by Professor Corinne Fowler at Leicester and colleagues, and the links to Austen characters is in the sense that it's not really about what Jane Austen writes, it's about what she doesn't write, and what is being erased here. And what is being erased is how her characters made their money. And you don't really need to research very far to see that if you are super rich in the 19th century, someone is being exploited here. And people like Darcy, Catherine de Bourgh, and other characters, you don't make that much money off being a doctor in the 19th century. You get it from colonialism and slavery and that sort of thing. So that's basically where I draw the links. And going to the National Trust sites, you then get to see the sort of physical, I guess, embodiments of what Jane Austen was writing about, but also the 19th century and the idea of permanence. I think at the beginning of the essay, I do mention David Olusoga's Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners documentary, and when you go to these sites and you look at how they're built, so you've got the buildings and then you've got the gardens, and so forth, and you look out and there is that perhaps these things were built to last forever in a way, and I think that's the idea that imperialists had in their head of the British Empire, that it would last forever, and that's sort of the level of, I guess, arrogance that they had. And then you look at characters like Darcy, with all their wealth, and how the wealth is passed on between each generation, and they think that wealth is going to last forever as well. So I think the National Trust, not specifically the National Trust, but the buildings that they own, can give an alternative perspective of how we read Austen and how they made their money. And the researchers that did that report have done a lot of the work in terms of slavery and colonialism, and it's public and free as well. So I'll just probably tell people, go and look at the National Trust report and then go and read Austen and tell me that it doesn't add up, because I won't. So that's essentially the connection I made between the National Trust and Jane Austen, but also the basically the society that she lived in as well.
Right, and then also the tourism that still continues to happen. People visiting these National Trust sites as Jane Austen pilgrimages. Yeah,
people still visit trust sites with sort of I guess you'd call it cognitive dissonance in their heads. They'll go there really quite ignorant and happy and like, yeah, it's very pretty and beautiful, but not realizing that the only reason you can visit those sites is because of it was built off the pillage and plunder that British Empire committed, and not just through plantation slavery, but also through other forms of exploitation. Some place like India as well, which was also another time, which was also exploited. I'm sure Shashi Tharoor writes about this extensively in Inglorious Empire, and how the British drained India dry from being one of the most prolific economies in the world to an economy that was at the point of partition was something like 4% of the global market. So I think there's definitely a lot of cognitive dissonance that happens there. You go visit these sites as a nice family day out, and then a lot of people don't see or refuse to see that they can only visit those sites because somebody was being exploited, and 9 times out of 10, Black and brown people in the global South, whether that's colonialism and slavery in the Caribbean, or someone like India as well.
Thank you. As we try to contextualize all of this within Austen, we also have all of it really coming to a forefront with Pineapplegate and Sanditon, where Jane Austen's unfinished work brings in an heiress who is half Black. And so we saw an adaptation of that, which created a lot on the internet, a lot of kerfuffle. And Amanda Ray, your essay kind of talks about this. It talks about it entirely. So what was it like revisiting these events and these situations as part of the Pineapplegate controversy, where people in the fandom were racist, insulting? What was that process like for you?
Part of it was frustrating, not so much upsetting, because at this point I was revisiting it about a year after it happened. So I had time to cry, to talk about it with my close friends, and talk about it with my colleagues here, and process the emotional feelings. I can then go back and take a more critical look into, and I think my frustration quickly began a matter of people deleted their accounts. People, whether because they're trying to hide the traces, or again, even very recently, people were protesting the whole Elon Musk thing on Twitter. So people went back and deleted things that were there. So me realizing that I should have been archiving things as I was going. But when you're angry, and when you're, when you feel like everybody is ganging up on you, you don't have time to think about taking screen caps or going to the web archives to look at these things. But I always wanted to write about Pineapplegate from my own perspective, because because my tweets were some of the first to directly confront Sanditon fandom about why are they glorifying the pineapple, because they were selectively, because the thing with pop culture and fandom is that people cherry pick information to support their arguments. And where I think academia missed the big chance here was for academics to say, we did this work on how the pineapple ties into colonialism or anything about colonialism, so that those arguments would have been rendered mute by, they may not have listened, but the Sanditon fandom built up their own sense of authority because they were in the fandom and organizing the renewal campaign, all that. So when I started talking to them, like, no, you can't say that. They're like, who are you? And I'm like, how do you not know who I am when I've been, before Pineapplegate, I was live tweeting Masterpiece PBS shows every single Sunday. So even people hate me, they know who I am. But I realized very quickly that a lot of the Sanditon outrage and organizing was made by European and British fans who do not know that conversation about race and stuff is different outside of UK and Europe, that they cannot yell at and speak over Black Americans, whether they're African American, whether they're like me, who I'm from the Caribbean. So like, you can't shout over us and expect us to engage with you in that sense. And they kept saying Sanditon fans for everyone, but there was always a caveat. It's for everyone who likes their point of view. But I realized that because I have been blogging about period drama for a long time before I started freelancing, I realized that people were not going to confront these folks, whether because they either didn't know who they are or they don't have the energy for this. I was like, you know what? People already know me, that I want to confront people about this stuff, so I decided to go for it. And the Daily Beast article is written, but of course journalists don't have the time to go back and revisit things. So I decided, and also I was especially afraid that even before Persuasion's article came out, that academics would start writing about my tweets and then interpreting my anger as something that was just, oh, she's angry all the time, or why was she talking about this? Or I didn't want people putting words in my mouth. That's why I had to write this myself. And I also had the understanding that academics were not going to know what to look for in terms of tweets that are racist or problematic, because a lot of people like to hide what they're saying behind things that are socially acceptable. So yeah, revisiting Pineapplegate was actually kind of freeing for me, because over that year, I found that many more people agreed with me than the people who were attacking me back then. They felt overwhelming, but I realized that was just them being critical of their power or perceived power being challenged. And that the Black Lives Matter movement actually helped them become more and more isolated in fandom, because actually there's, again, another unfortunate thing about tweets being deleted. Rose Williams and Crystal Clark both tweeted and they posted on Instagram about how Black Lives Matter tied into the show, and they were arguing with them in the comments, and a lot of that has been now deleted. And actually Crystal Clark deleted her entire Twitter account because of repeated fan harassment around the issue of her around her role in the show, and people believe that she needs to represent everybody in a fandom and put an undue burden on her to, you know, do more than just be an actor. Like, she had to do a lot of emotional labor both on the set and off the set in social media, because white fans just did not understand where she was coming from, whether on screen or off screen as well. So my essay is pointing out that these conversations, academia moves at a pace that cannot capture tweets effectively. Cannot capture conversations on Facebook. That's actually another part of the thing that's missing. There's a lot of Facebook conversation I cannot include because of the legal risk, whether to myself or to ABO, because people would claim that we were doxing them. So basically my archival work it's actually very simple. It was an Excel sheet, a Google sheet, web archive, because I wanted to make sure people would be able to read the tweets as they were presented at the time. I didn't want people to claim that I was fabricating tweets. So web archive lives forever. It's there permanently. They can't be removed unless they have to go through a whole lengthy legal process to remove things off there. And now that it's been published and cited in an academic journal, they cannot apply to remove those tweets, which is why I did that. So, because I even mentioned yesterday, as I was writing it, people were trying to clean up their reputation and pretend that they weren't involved in this as the conversation moved on. And since the season 2 is aired, more people have entered the fandom, so some folks want to pretend that this didn't happen.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
like, I really want to stress, like, there's a large swath of people who join the fandom who have no idea of the past of this, and it's great to have this and the Daily Beast article to remind folks. I actually want to bring up that, like, Amanda and I and other people remind people of, no, there's been racism that's happened here. There's been trauma that's happened here. There are people who really don't like it to the degree that they will keep harassing you. Like I've had people, I know Amanda's had people that keep even today harassing over these things. Someone actually, a different Twitter account had shared that Virtual Jane Con was coming out, and a woman who had harassed me, a Sanditon sister who had harassed me and also Amanda, and then she immediately blocked me after she sent like vitriol at me, because that's the game they play. And also a reminder that if they block you, they can still see your stuff, so block them back if they do it. That's how Twitter works. But she had like replied to this other person's tweet promoting Jane Con with, actually, no one should be promoting this, like it's not very Jane Austen at all. And it's just like that kind of stuff where it's just like these people really don't want to be confronted with the reality still of the, like, how that was racist, and they'll do anything they can to keep coming for you and anything that you touch because they're that upset that you would even dare to talk about what actually happened. And I think that's, like, again, Samantha said, like, citing those things and having them continue to live and be there to see and witness is so critical.
Yeah, and I just, the whole thing, the reason we call the collection Race and Racism in Austen Spaces is just to say what there's so much energy going into denying. I mean, that's really what each of that joins the papers is, that there is, whiteness itself is also a race. I think that's what's really missing from the conversation, is that there's this huge push to say, you're bringing race into this, or you're politicizing. Jane Austen authors deleted posts that even drew attention to the fact that slave owners in the colonies fathered many children. They said, well, that's not relevant, or you're politicizing our pleasure. And I think that's part of the dynamic we need to disrupt. It's not simply about taking away people's pleasure. It's about asking people questions about what their pleasure is intertwined with, and to have some responsibility about that. And what's quite surprising is just the violence and the energy, polite editings and refusals of papers to aggression, harassment. This is all part of a spectrum of gatekeeping where, again, across the board, from academia to fandoms and adaptation, circles, there is a desire to police how we talk about the realities of the race and racism in Austen's time and the race and racism now. And I think that's, our little volume is just an attempt to begin being very explicit about these dynamics.
And you know what? I actually also really want to, sorry, but the two things you mentioned, politics and the idea of politeness and politeness, those are also two red flag rules in these Facebook groups, in these communities, that a ton of people are still involved in. Like, these things have thousands and thousands of members. Those are those two red flag rules that always show up in that. The no politics rule and like the Jane Austen fan club, and others that are of the same, like, similar things. I think Austen authors have their own thing too. And then there's, let's focus on polite conversation. And the way those are enacted, those two rules, they are always a red flag to me, because the only way I've ever seen them policed, if you will, or used or whatever, is to specifically say, we're going to erase the conversation of people of color. Like, everyone's talking about, like, out here about like, well, Bridgerton might give people unrealistic ideas about whatever. And I'm just like, you really want to talk about who's been giving unrealistic ideas about what the fuck the Regency looked like? Because let me tell you, it's all these people who are like in your book clubs, that at your meetings or at your AGMs that are in these places, because they are there. There's a majority of people that are in those groups that are consuming this information that is specifically curated to delete the, like, even a post that says a person of color existed. Like, that's what they're doing with those rules. That's what we're seeing. Again, it's crazy. Like, it's the spectrum. But if you want to know, like, the groundwork is in these Facebook groups, these things people are talking in daily, is that they're saying this, and they're saying that if you say racism, it's impolite. You're the impolite person. They're saying they're doing, and this is all tied to white supremacy. Like, this idea that we're going to erase the idea that people of color existed. That we just popped up one day to be, you know,
in the 1960s.
It's wild, but it's also just like, as much as it can be wild, I'm like, this is also like a wake-up call to every person who uses these groups to promote their talk, their book, any of that stuff. If you're okay doing that in those spaces, you also need to understand that you're reinforcing these ideas, and you're telling them, if you are in these groups that are doing this, you are saying to them that you are one of them. And that's what every person in the room is going to remember, who's been paying attention, because you're aligning yourself with, you'd rather, again, kind of like the money of like the idea of like, where'd the money come from for Darcy? Where's all the money for these things coming from? We're going to remember that you are interacting and engaging with these audiences, and you do not care they've been racist. You do not care that they have alienated, marginalized people in your community. If you're okay making money off of them, well, we remember that. It's also documented because it's on social media now. So
that was another problem that I wanted to bring up in my essay, is that people in these academic and Facebook groups and other spaces, these admins and moderators deleted me, and some of those groups even went in Sanditon fandom, or even went as far as to preemptively ban me, even though I never joined their group, and ban people bringing up the original Pineapplegate article from the Daily Beast that Jasmine Trott wrote. They banned them from even posting that in the group. And by extension, a whistleblower, although unfortunately I couldn't use this in the essay, a whistleblower sent me a screen cap of a comment thread calling me mentally ill. Not knowing anything about my personal background in that at all. They just assumed because I was talking about this, because again, the harassment was days and weeks and months of me hearing this stuff from white people. They were calling me mentally ill for even bringing up attention to this fact. And I'm like, the people were actively ignoring this, and showing, I needed to show people that this happened, but it's going to happen again. I already see it happening with the reaction to Netflix's Persuasion, which is going to only get worse, because as of recording, it's not out yet, but that it's coming out literally the day before Virtual Gen Con happens. Whatever is discussed or not discussed in that fandom, in that film, it's going to spill out into fandom, and people's perceptions of these characters that are probably predicated on whiteness, and how fans of color react to that is going to be very different. And there's already going to be gatekeeping likely about, if you like this film, you're not a true Austen fan. Whatever the film says. I'm only basing on seeing on the trailer reaction, but fandom organizes itself in a way to alienate the very people. They claim Austen's for everyone. They don't understand that Austen should be free to be interpreted in any way you see fit. And they don't want to have that conversation. And they don't want to have that conversation about how adaptations that are modernized, they're not discussing Austen the way you learned it from your English professor or in high school. They're not going to reflect that. They're going to reflect creative license, and they're going to reflect screenwriting, other skills that Austen fans may not have understanding or access to. And unfortunately, I work as a journalist sometimes. Covering pop culture, I don't always have time to unpack all these things. So that's why that was a good thing about the essay space, is that it wasn't connected to to the cycle of promoting what's coming up next. I had time to sit down and unpack all the meaning, because I don't always have time to do that when I'm reviewing something. And also too, sometimes editors, tell me I have to look at something a certain way for their audience. And that's the thing with social media, is that it is the permanence of social media. People think it just, people think it just is over 24 hours. No, it's not. Like, these conversations have to continue on for months and months and months. And there's also a danger in ignoring how private groups feed into this cycle of not only just racism and fandom, but how people interpret Austen and then by extension, the Austen adaptations. There's a sort of a unofficial, official way of looking at canon. And that feeds into fandom in a way that people have not analyzed yet. And that's what I tackle in my essay.
Yeah. Like, I also want to add, like, we've already seen just like blatant, like, there was the article that literally says like millennials are to blame for this new persuasion and like using millennial derogatorily. And like, because you do, like, that's ageist. Like, I'm sorry, it's ageist. Like, if anyone doesn't think that's ageist, like, please reassess your life choices. We've already seen that get shared, and specifically, I'm gonna say it was shared in Jasna groups, and I called out it, and I was told that I didn't know better because I was so young, that like a person, literally self-proclaimed boomer, was just like, if you have as much experience as I do, this white man in my shit. But like, here's the thing, like, Amanda is spot on. That's already started, and if you can recognize that, like, I had so many people, including an RC, haha, my thing, saying this is really ageist and like inappropriate. Like, this is like what this is reinforcing. And I also want to just say, the blank is for everybody thing started as this internal grassroots thing from marginalized fans to me, including me. It has now been slapped on merchandise. And it's not just the Jane Austen space, it's other spaces. And I'm going to just say, it was meant to say Jane Austen is for everyone, AKA the not white folks.
Right.
Too.
Yes.
For the marginalized community. I have seen racists be able to buy this merchandise. And what that means is it is a feel-good thing that now means nothing. Because it's now been
all lives matter type.
It's literally all lives matter now. It has become all lives matter. It has lost all context. And it's so upsetting to see that be used when it was like, I remember the conversations we were having in Jane Austen Universe about what kind of hashtags do we want to use internally in our group to do stuff. And one of the reasons that we didn't do like the Austen for all, Austen for everybody, was specifically because we're like, it has become this thing that's essentially all lives matter. We had this deep conversation about this, and then I see Jasna folks with like Jane Austen's for everybody, they literally reply to things with a meme or with whatever of that, and I'm just like, I've literally seen a racist person, like a known problematic person in the community, use that, and I'm like, it means nothing now, because it literally is just someone excusing their behavior by being like, I posted a thing, and it's not the work, it's not unpacking anything, it doesn't address anything. So like, all that to say, like, these are integral problems. And when people keep slapping a slogan on something instead of doing the work, like, I understand trying to like solidify and make something concise so that you can talk about easily in places that have limited character count. But if you're just taking away all meaning, if you're just not contextualizing it, we have a problem. And the problem is that there's unaddressed rampant racism and gatekeeping. And I think, again, like, this is what we're all talking about, but I think like that's part of it. It's that like, even when we make these small strides, then someone keeps going back to like, well, I wasn't saying that because I think that Jane Austen is for everybody. And it's just like, what do you actually mean by that? Like, honestly, the next time you see someone post any of that as a comment, as a meme, as whatever, I want you to ask them what they've actually done. How have you
actively include?
How have you confronted racism? Because
I want to give Trey a chance to jump in on this, because in your article, you specifically say that online Austen spaces, while they're not institutions as we think of them, are still practicing institutional whiteness. And this is, I think, what everyone is pointing to. So I wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're not institutions, then you will have certain people in those groups acting gatekeeping, and then they're not sort of nominated as the unofficial ambassadors of the groups. I guess you'd call them on Facebook at least. It's like the admins, which would be the equivalent of a CEO of an institution. And then you get like the people who are under the admin, so like the moderators, who are then sort of used to police Black and Brown fans I found in the group. So that they're not institutions, but they sort of act like them. And then the doing of whiteness in that regard becomes the norm of the group, and that's really how institutions become white. So it's not really institutional racism only goes so far as to say that neglect essentially, and when these institutional racism quite a lot, because it's really, we don't really say the doing of racism, the conscious doing of racism, but what institutions have failed to do. But then at the expense of Black and Brown people and Black and Brown emotions and so on, these places become white to the benefit of thought and emotions and so on. So yeah, the institutional whiteness is pervasive, but at the expense of Black and Brown feelings and trauma, as Bianca and Amanda had talked about earlier. So yeah, these groups they're not institutions, but if they were, they would fit the bill essentially of the doing of institutional whiteness and institutionalizing it to a certain degree. That is so. If I highlight anything, or if Bianca does, or Amanda does, or Kerry does, we would be seen as like causing trouble and insurrection, and that sort of thing. And I know when I've been in these groups, I've been blocked as well from these groups. I've been for simply talking about race, in not just Austen, but in the English canon in general. One of the examples I found is that so the guy Lord Byron, people know about Lord Byron, and he was in an episode of Doctor Who. I think it was the last series, the series before, and Bill Richmond, who Will was based off in Bridgerton, actually trained Lord Byron in boxing as well. So Lord Byron, the famous Lord Byron, who was a white guy, was trained by a black guy, and even just highlighting basic historical facts like that are a mandate for you to be harassed and then probably chased out of the group or blocked from the group as well. So there's a lot of violence that happens within these groups, and you get mobbed. So it's not just one person, but you get mobbed by 5 or 6 people to the point where you leave beyond psychological safety. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to butt in a little bit. It's just what I want to just draw attention to, though, is that while our methodology is often named as rabble rousing or causing problems or political, in fact, as Amanda was talking especially, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that the methodology is actually very Austen-esque in the sense that we're reading the silences, as Trey said, which you can't read an Austen novel and not read the silence. And we remember, of course, the famous silence that everybody's talked about when Fanny asks about slavery in Mansfield Park and she's met with silence. It's like, yes, everything we're sitting on here in this drawing room comes from our Antigua plantations, but we don't talk about it. And Austen names that silence in her books, and the pressure of wanting to maintain that silence. Austen invites us to read the micro communications, that neither tweets or neither, misuses of phrases. I mean, Austen would be the first person to satirize the misuse of a phrase like Austen is for everyone. She'd be even if she's not an anti-racist, I think Austen herself would be the first person to get how these slogans can become entirely meaningless. I know that the sort of fashionable world of the ton that she critiqued, even as she moved through it, she would be able to see how these reform on social media or academic spaces or where they intertwine. And so I think I want to make a little claim for our critique, our sort of, as she says, it's not I don't write for dull elves. And we're trying to make sure that that critique, that necessary social awareness of how power works, which I also think is integral to Austen's novels, is part of our methodology. And so we're also making a claim that these methodologies are important for Austen studies and for analysing, you know, the period then and its afterlives now. And if we gatekeep those methodologies, we're going to lose really important tools that are insightful.
Going back to Trey's earlier point about the groups and banning, I mean, my day job when I'm not writing articles is I am a content moderator for a fairly large media company, which I'm going to redact. My job every day is to police groups to avoid saying hate speech and the like. So when I see Austen groups and Austen spaces not doing that work, I'm like, you're exposing yourself to legal risk you don't even know about, because actually you're allowing people to violate the terms of service of the social media platforms. Because unfortunately, a lot of these folks just volunteer their time and they don't understand it. They're taking on a legal responsibility when you're moderating content, or you're admin on Facebook. You're taking on responsibility you don't even understand. And these rules, like, for example, no politics is supposed to be don't discuss current elections or things like that, but they interpret that to be don't discuss historical racism, which is not what it means. There are obviously groups to discuss current elections or current issues, but they always use that to talk. They always use that to derail how, because again, all these productions are addressing modern social issues and human rights issues that are not, you cannot divorce these things on screen from what we're seeing right now. Again, frequently, there's going to be more discussions about actors of color playing traditionally right roles, not just in all those Sanditans and taking that path. We have Mr. Malcolm's List, we have the new Persuasion film. There's going to be more of these productions and this work to understand how racists have gotten away with derailing these conversations, these groups, all begins because people have taken on responsibilities that they don't understand. And that's kind of where I started my work from, is reading what people are not saying or what they're hiding when they say things is so important.
I think, like, what's interesting to me too is, like, even Austen, like, herself was very biased and knew she was biased in her opinions about the monarchy and everything. And I'm just like, you know, again, it's almost erasing that Austen comes from a place of context too. And I think that's also like the weird troubling thing, is these same people that are yelling, "You're not a Jane Austen purist," quote unquote. It's like, well, what are you even reading? Like, are we reading the same Austen? You know, like, that's really a question that I have a lot of times. Are we reading the same books? Are we actually, like, you know, you're throwing all these facts at me, but have we read the same stuff from her? Because she, you know, she has very specific feelings on all of these things.
The novels are deeply political. And I think it's that somehow for a lot of people, the pleasure of what the Regency might have to offer now will be spoiled by the politicization of it. And I think that's the fetishization of a Regency world, like what Trey was talking about. I mean, I used to live in the south of England for a long time too, lived near Bath, so beautiful. But remember, Austen herself hated the white heat of Bath. She thought it was trashy. That she thought this was new money sprouting up everywhere. It was never not political for her. So for people to cling on to this Regency ideal as a sort of epitomizing an Englishness and a whiteness, I think we really need to examine the currency of that right now. Why is that so important to so many people? And why do they want it to be depoliticized? I think that's the next, that's where we have to keep probing.
I think with that as well, like, not being political seen as synonymous with not talking about race in a sense, and obviously that extends to any like something like your mark of difference. So I think in these groups it's race, but also things like sexuality as well, misogyny. Ironically, I think I found quite a lot of internalized misogyny in those groups, and even disability. So the TV, like the World on Fire program, which had women characters, had disabled characters, it had black characters, had gay characters in it, and that show really got people upset in those groups. I think particularly, I found it more problematic that there was no politics rule was being applied to Sanditon, which had a character that was West Indian and did talk about slavery quite explicitly in certain areas, and we've been told that you can't talk about it because it's too political, essentially. And for me, it gets a bit more personal because where Mansfield Park is set is in Northamptonshire, and that's where I grew up and still live. And even talking about slavery and Northamptonshire, I find very difficult because today it's still said we've got a statue here in the middle of the town of Charles II, who was, I guess, the equivalent of the CEO of the Royal African Company. And for those who are watching at home, that company was the largest human trafficking corporation in the history of the slave trade as we know it. And it was run by Charles II, then his brother as well, James, Duke of York, who later became James II. Yet when you talk about any of this in these groups, it's seen as political, and it shouldn't be political. Historical facts should not be political in that sense. And then because you're also black person or brown person saying this, a lot of this is our family history as well. And then you get, that's when it gets a bit more people. You see more of the white fragility coming out, because it's not just history. It's that your variant is contingent on the stories that we are seeing through Sanditon specifically and Mansfield Park, and many of the other Austen stories, and how they made their money was through colonial exploitation. So yeah, it gets a lot of these people triggered in the groups that it's not just historical, it's personal, and the personal is historical. When you start talking in language like that, that they get a bit frustrated and mad, and that's when you see the white fragility. And
I think it's that ownership of, it's not your history, it's our history. It's not, when you say that, Trey, it really, it's the history of black and brown people too, of people in India, of people who were trafficked, of people who are subject to the making of the nation states. It's our history too. Austen is our history too. And so that really makes a mockery of that Austen is for everyone, that everyone is being used as a whitewash, as Bianca said, so I think that's what we're pushing. And as you say, it's lived present day history. One of the other triggering events of this volume was the toppling of Colston statue in Bristol, which was, again, I lived in Bristol, I taught in Bristol for a long time, and I used to bring my students down to the Colston statue, and they would have walked past it regularly from the train station to get the bus up to the university, and they did not know from walking past that statue what Colston had done. That's the whole point, this idea that we're erasing history by taking down statues. No, these statues are monuments to blood, really, to blood money. And so the toppling of Colston makes us think of, well, what else do we need what other myths do we need to topple down? Bristol still has the merchant ventures. The sources of their wealth are entirely tied to the income from slavery. And in Derby, which Derbyshire at the moment makes a lot of its money from tourists coming up to tour Pride and Prejudice land, even if Jane herself never got that far. And I write about the Fitzherberts of Tissington Hall, who had Jamaica plantations for all through the 18th century, and have kept that money and that property intact right up until now. So it isn't past, it isn't over, it's living history. And what are the feelings of black children when they're brought in to see kneeling statues of black children holding things like servants? What are the feelings of those children as they walk into those spaces? Or what are the white feelings that those spaces are supposed to create? That's so the whole heritage aspect of this is hugely important too.
And to tie in heritage, a lot of times people visit these sites because of pop culture. I mean, all of these places are often filming locations for Sanditon and other period dramas. You have the people who just dismiss television and movies as just a thing, no, they're going to be the entryways that people are learning about these issues, and these spaces are where conversations are happening. And what's also potentially more problematic is that these informal spaces are creating their own version of history and historical interpretation, which does not have, which is not, tied to what historians are actually saying. That's actually a big thing too. When I would point out history, people are like, well, I wasn't taught that in school. I'm like, yes, because you were taught by people who are enshrined in the old ways to think about his history, erasing. You've been taught whitewash history, and going back to ageism, they use that as a weapon against marginalized people of color. Because oftentimes we know a lot more about other people's histories than the histories we were taught ourselves about our own groups. So what we represent, like a lot of our education is because people downplay what we know because it's been taught informally or passed orally, and it's not been filtered through the realms of academia or other things. So that's a huge factor in all of our essays, is that who is determined to be, who are the quote experts and to listen to, is a huge factor too.
That's literally like also one of the inspirations for the Heyer essay, was that like I was in Berlin's conversation with somebody who was literally, it came out like they were pretty much regurgitating like something that a professor had told them about. Like someone was very upset basically that Heyer or Regency Romance would even be brought up in a Jane Austen group. And of course, I kept explaining like a bunch of people, as you will see in this thread, have been recommended her with no context. But this person eventually in their conversation, it came out that they were like, well, my professors when I was in school really told me that this was inappropriate. And so again, it's this like regurgitating the cycle of taking these things, especially older generations, taking these limited viewpoints that they've had, and regurgitating it. I think, again, that's why it's so critical that even current academics take the time to unpack these things and listen and expand what they're consuming and what lens they're consuming it through. Because if you hear an argument, I feel like so often it's dismissed, like, well, it's just silly or whatever, but it's like, these are active conversations that are happening online that these people are regurgitating, that they are bringing in to try to literally shut down a conversation, and to be like, no, I'm telling you this because my professor told me this, so it's the absolute truth. And there's so much baggage with that, right? There's just so much baggage with that. But that's the baggage that everything that everyone is teaching in their classroom right now is setting up their students to have and to bring into these cyclical conversations, which is why it's extra important to be considerate of these things.
And Austen studies in academia remains overwhelmingly white. Marcus Gonzalez talks about that in his essay. Do they know that? Do these people know? I'm a Latino man sitting in a conversation about Austen with an entirely white woman seminar, and what does that mean? And a lot of 18th century studies has a huge reckoning to do to really, that's part of my work, is to say, slavery is not a side issue in the 18th century. It is fundamental. In the genocide of Native Americans is not like a side issue. It's not a political topic. It's fundamental to the making of everything that the 18th century would like to celebrate: reason, science, liberty. I saw a tweet this morning, slave owners writing about liberty. That's the 18th century ideal, is that we take the idea that it was Thomas Jefferson who invented freedom. It's absurd. And the kinds of freedoms, in fact, that Austen herself might have wanted to promote also aren't necessarily as inclusive as people might wish. So I think that's something we have to go into with clear eyes about. So yeah, these are structural problems that that's why, that's another thing, these voices, that we must be intersectional, we must be multidisciplinary, we need all these different tools all the time. And that's not polluting the waters of Austen studies, that's bringing all our abilities, because we actually care about this work, but we also are aware of the power that Austen continues to have, and it looks like it's going to keep growing. So there's a real urgency for this work to keep going on, to be very, it's not just about raining on people's parade or spoiling the party, but as as Amanda said, just remembering these things have a history, they have a context. The conversations are political, and erasing that is deliberate.
That's a great. Go ahead, Kerry.
Yeah, I think there as well, like going off the back of what Bianca and Kerry was saying as well, like with academia. At least in the UK, at professor level as well, Black professors in the UK are less than 1% of professors are Black in this country, and that, I think that's less than 200. And then when you look at numbers of white professors, it's in the thousands, 10,000 plus professors, white professors in this country. So when I go to America, and in America, seeing a Black professor is not out. It's the norm. Seeing Black as a professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's coined the term intersectionality, is a professor. But when you come here and see a Black professor, it is there's so few of them, you can count them, and that's what we're dealing with here in the UK in terms of academia, and that's professors generally. So when you think about Black historians who are specialists in certain areas, then the numbers are even more depleted there. And academia being one, as I said in my essay, that where academia is one of the main sites of colonialism, and the modern university would not be where it is today without its legitimization, I guess, of colonialism, empire, and the theories that went into the invention of race and so on. And then when it comes to Austen and discussing Austen, we can't talk about any of that stuff without considering the complicity of the institution of the university within that. And that's what gets universities scared, because that level of critique would mean they'll start to look at themselves and what a decolonial university would look like. So yeah, there's lots to consider there. And the UK is a whole different thing to America. In America, academia's got issues, but Britain's it's literally empire land here always. Yeah, but yeah, I think we look at academia of historical colonialism, but still the continued legacy of that, and there are certain people who have investment in that, and the moving of capital as well, like neoliberalism, which affects both the UK and the US. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that as well.
Thank you. So to make explicit, the conversation has been kind of happening. Why should people pay attention to these issues? Why should we pay attention to the white supremacy, the racism, harassment in online Austen and Austen adjacent spaces? And I'd like to hear from everyone.
We need to pay attention because it's still happening. And especially for academics who have to study things after the fact, if you're not looking at things now, when you need to discuss them in a year or two, you're not going to have that information because you weren't engaging in the space, right? Even you don't have to argue directly with people, because I understand academics have, rules about conflict of interest, and when you're doing sociological studies, they have those forms where you have to have their risk assessment, and I forgot what they call it, but you know what I mean. There's rules to follow, but you can be a member in these spaces and look at the conversations, then gather your evidence, and then write whatever you want to write later on. But you're missing, but by treating things as just the internet is not. You're kind of already putting yourself on the back foot, especially when you're analyzing pop culture, because the media companies are going to keep using Austen and Regency romance adaptations to make money.
Yes.
They are reading comments online, even if they don't say it, but they're doing their market research based on these online conversations and based on how many people are clicking on their show. Mm-hmm. So when people complain about Austen canon being misinterpreted by pop culture, it's because the media companies are not consulting academics when they're making films and television shows. They have demographics, and often the most vocal Austen fans, both online and academia, they're going to be depending on your viewpoint, you're going to be the last to be considered. And because it does come down to demographics, and often the demographics they're seeking are not the demographics that Austen fandom necessarily represents. As we can see already from that Persuasion Netflix trailer, all the language was designed to target women between the ages of 18 and 35, and everybody who complained about it was past the age of 35. Well, not everybody, but a lot of the complaints were from people who are not in that demographic, because they're pursuing Generation Z and millennial viewers with a certain sense of humor and dialogue. They're like, well, that's not Austen. I'm like, the conversation here isn't about how you interpret Austen and how academics interpret Austen. It's about how the average person who's scrolling through Netflix interprets Austen. And those conversations begin with social media. And that's how we need to think about when we're discussing, like I will talk about in my solo presentation here at Virtual Jane Con. It's when you're taking social media as just a thing, as just a daily diary, you're missing so much that's happening, because you're not involving people who don't have degrees, who aren't teachers, who aren't professors. There are everyday people. Social media is the easiest way now to get what everyday people think about these issues.
I agree, as these productions are going to keep expanding who the audience actually is, like actually doing the like Jane Austen's for everybody asterisks, like being like, these are opportunity audiences, because like basically statistically, like younger folks, aka this much disparaged millennials and younger, and people of color, marginalized folks. Fire Island specifically was like a queer retelling of Pride and Prejudice, just amazing, phenomenal, and done with such heart. But I think it really, if people, especially in academia and other circles, are not thinking about these contexts and how these are going to be centering younger audiences, then you are missing the lens of which people are going to be first introduced to Austen. You are completely missing. It will not be at a university. It won't even be in a high school classroom anymore. It's going to continue to be much earlier, much younger, and it's going to be through a lens that does center, because Hollywood in a lot of these places are trying to recenter not only their audiences, but then how do you do that on screen? It's through having diverse writing, directors, production. Like, it may not be perfect yet, but there are productions that are trying really hard to do that, and they're seeing success. Like, I think that undeniably the success of Bridgerton is going to be building into how the perception of the Regency is. And if you ignore that, and again, it's not that it's not flawed, but also Regency romance hasn't been flawed, because Heyer herself, the quote founder of that genre, was a very flawed person. If we ignore all of the reasons why we got here, then the work people are doing is going to be irrelevant, period.
Kerry or Trey, did you want to add to why we should be paying attention to this white supremacy, racism, and harassment?
I think first of all, I think what affects me the most is sort of the microaggressions, and I think people underestimate the damage that microaggressions can do to people's health as well. So I think the term biological weathering is probably one that people in this chat have heard before, where the microaggressions aren't just subtle things. When you experience them day after day, over a lifetime, they can compromise your immune system, and then lead to an early death. And I did mention that in my essay. I talked about Chester Pierce being the psychiatrist that came up with the term microaggression, and he compares it to racism as a contagious disease that leads to the early demise of, in his context, it was African American in the civil rights movement. So I think that's one aspect say if like one person watching Jane Austen in the groups, you will experience. I don't say it's likely you'll probably experience racism at some point, and probably have health effects because of it. So I think that'd be one reason, but also going off what Bianca says, if these groups don't come to draw essentially 21st behind essentially, and I think compare what happening with Austen, what happened to be in the mid-noughties, thinking about the BBC adaptation of Charles Dickens' Bleak House, and how the format of storytelling sort of changed then with the BBC and Bleak House. They did it in 30-minute episodes, like a sort of soap sort of drama, and but then that's changed for the BBC, and then they did it again with Poldark as well, and that got people upset because the storytelling method was different. And even looking at Amor Sante's Belle as well, that is a period drama, but it's made in a very modern way. And I know some of the period drama fandom didn't like it for that reason, that it didn't feel like a period drama to them. So yeah, I think in terms of the racism, like that's just one aspect of it. If you don't join the 21st century, it will leave you behind, essentially. And that's not just for period dramas, but that's generally academia in general, and going based off what Amanda was saying about social media and Twitter. I know if I cited tweets in an essay, I would be told that they're not legitimate references. But if I cited a journal article or a chapter from a book, they would be seen as legitimate references. And in many cases, the fact that academia does focus on that could be seen as racism in general, because some people might have more access to social media tweets than they would an academic book. And a lot of these books are like £150, £2 one book. And sometimes your university doesn't have that book, so you have to go looking for it, and these academic texts can be expensive. So I think, yeah, there's the health arguments for microaggressions and racism in the fandom, but there's also the other things that people might not have considered, like epistemic racism through the knowledge that universities maintain. And I know from Kerry's point of view, when she has students and so forth, I think it's probably more important now that lecturers especially tell students to find things that are accessible and open access, and you're not contribute to your personal finances to pay for it.
Yeah, and I suppose for me, as somebody who's working in academia with all of these tensions, if we think of the United States and the UK as two of the main sites of Austen fandom that we're talking about, not the only, and I know it's global, but these are maybe two of the main sites in Northern European. What are we witnessing right now? We're witnessing the rise of white supremacy in these nation states. What do the UK and the United States have in common? They were slaving nations. They were, the United States, as I keep reminding my own students, until 1776 was a British colony, and it was considered largely a backwater of the British Empire because all the focus was on the Caribbean. And so part of my work is to make sure that people realize the Caribbean has been marginalized now, but it was utterly central to the making of 18th century 17th and 18th century Britain, which then became integral to the making of this entity that we are in right now, the United States of America. So that, Austen's currency now, why do people want this Regency whiteness? What is there in it for them? Why do they want to keep it archaic, not up to date? Why do they want to keep it gendered in certain ways that are very heteronormative? Why do they want to, what kinds of pleasures are people seeking? And there's different ways to do cosplay that are transgressive, but there are ways to do cosplay that are really, really oppressive. And so I think, if we don't, there is a movement of tide here, and if we don't intervene in that movement, these spaces will become very continue to be very hostile, but also continues, as Amanda said, to put out mythical versions of the past that are simply not true. So for me, the Austen is current because she keeps being reproduced, and to that extent blocking other narratives. That's something I personally, as much as I'm an Austen lover, I kind of resent, that there are so many other stories to be told, and yet we have to watch another adaptation of Persuasion when maybe we need something else to tell. A story of a rebelling 18th century woman who doesn't want to be sitting in silence with her pain. We could write that script, and maybe that woman could be a woman of color, would have been a woman of color, because we know there were at least 20,000 Black free people in late 18th century London alone, and that's just what we know. Nicole Aldo is doing amazing work on archives of Black Britain in that period, and one thing that North Americans might find quite surprising is in England you did not list race on any papers of people, because it wasn't a category. It was only a category in the colonies where blackness, whiteness were being made. The blood quantum rules came from the colonies to make sure that you could not vote unless you were 6 degrees separated from your Black mother. And that's why Georgiana is so radical. So for me, the formations of white supremacy that we're witnessing now and that many of us are suffering under are inextricably linked to the 18th century. And I cannot, as Trey said, but go into any of these spaces without reading all of this. And I think that's just incredibly important to keep doing so.
How do we disrupt some of this? How do we disrupt, like Kerry, you wrote in your article that Austen cultures and racism are not only inextricable, but ongoingly self-reinforcing. Right. So how do those of us who want to fight against this tide and keep Austen open and able for reinterpretation, how do we disrupt this? And then, or alternatively, how can the audience continue some of the conversations that have happened in your essays?
Well, I mean, I think this is part of the disruption. So thank you, Bianca, instigator and disruptor. I think we have to actively make these networks. I've reached out to Bianca when I saw some troubles going on in Jasna, Trey, we've made these connections now. I reached out to Amanda, I reached out to Trey, and I, as I say, I'm grateful that we need to be able to trust each other to form those communities. You need to be able to name and say stuff in a space of freedom where even now, as I say, if you disagree, we often disagree with each other. I think people need to know that and have really, debate stuff, but that's really vital because, we're not polite, we're respectful. And that's something to keep in mind. So I think not fearing debate is really important, not being fearful of making connections, not being fearful of reaching outside your comfort zone, and just inherently valuing what other people have to say. So many of the people that I read on other social media spaces are, I am a mother, I'm a housewife, I'm learning so much. I want to know what that person thinks as much as I want to know what the next professorial book to come out is. So I think it's that checking our values all the time, and just keep making spaces for these conversations. But I think Bianca might have more to say about what people can actively do on social media to disrupt.
I definitely think that I think that a lot of the white folks in the community can take a space, take a kind of almost study group if they want to, of what are some networks we can make that are us protecting the people of color in our community. I've seen a lot of times people be like, oh, let's make a phone tree or whatever. I'm like, whatever y'all want to do, but don't put the onus on the people being attacked. Don't put the onus on marginalized folks in the community. Because I think that just keeps happening. People just keep waiting. And I also think that there needs to be a massive decentering of power. I think there needs to be a massive decentering of people being afraid to speak out against any kind of institutions, whether it be Jasna or others, because I literally have had professors in my DMs say that they support me, but they won't publicly say it. That they support that, they do think that they do agree that there are organizations, specifically Jasna, that are not doing enough, but they won't say it online. They won't say it publicly because they still need the income from that audience. And I think that that is a dangerous place to be in, because you're it's just, as we've talked about, money and income, those really matter where they came from. But I also think if you can't say any of this, then you're not an ally. Like if you cannot decenter that power and destabilize it and destabilize that comfort space, you are not an ally. You cannot call yourself an ally. If you can only like profess allyship in a DM and you're a white person, it means nothing. You're asking for absolution. And this is something that I've seen from other women of color and other communities who've had to deal with this. What you're doing is you're putting emotional labor on that person. Yet again, you're trying to get absolution, which you did not earn or deserve. And if you are not out here being able to be open on these platforms, because people are looking to you as a leader, then you're not an ally. Don't call yourself that. And maybe I'm going to start telling people, hey, I see you called yourself an ally. Remember this DM? Because I'm at that point of just being really tired of seeing people be heralded and like they've done nothing. They've not lifted a finger. And I think that's what you're gonna like start seeing too, an exhaustion from people, whether it's in academia, your colleagues who are tired of you taking over meetings and not doing anything to support their work or their funding, or it's people on the ground who saw you not stand up against racists and in fact invite them into your panels or your whatever, or you go to their events. Like you're gonna start seeing some pushback.
In terms of what I bring up in my essay with what people can do, a simple start would be if you're in an Austen fan space or you're on social media, and if you see, for example, people resharing articles or opinions that are racially problematic, don't leave it to me and other people in this panel to call that out. You definitely can start by saying, hey, the source you shared this, I don't think they address the issue properly, or they're ignoring race. Or for example, that Persuasion article blaming millennials, it was from a UK tabloid, which I've seen racist stuff come out from in the past. So yeah, that's a huge problem because people are not pointing these things out. Don't leave it to us to point things out that are problems. Please speak up at the time. Don't wait for other people to do it. And also conversation between you and your friends. You can point to your friend that, hey, that's not okay to say. Or are you sure that's the correct, are you sure that information is correct? Or are you sure you're not trying to say something that's a microaggression or dog whistle? That's what we can do that to start with. And also, if you belong to these groups or academia organizations, don't say things behind closed doors. You need to say things very publicly. And as a white ally, you can risk your position in a way we cannot. That's the key. You have to use your standing to stand up for other people who are not in that space, or who will be punished harsher for speaking up.
Thank you, Trey.
I think I can talk from like an academia perspective on this, and I think it'll be useful. I don't think you could read Austen properly without a contextual understanding of colonialism and empire and basically what it means. Sure, you can enjoy Austen, but to understand it fully and the level of world building that happens within those books is subject to empire and the money that came from empire and came into the hands of these propertied people to build their properties and maintain these properties and so on. So I think people would need to understand colonialism and empire. And that doesn't mean like you have to know loads. It just means just having a contextual knowledge of what empire is and what race is and how these things are intersecting with each other, and the economics of colonialism, and the amount of money that flooded into Britain, based on these things, and how the lives of these people was inextricably linked to that money, and if they didn't have that money, many of them would probably have been in poverty as well. That's the level what we're talking about here. So I think that would be one thing that could be done in terms of academia. So I'm thinking about, for example, history, sociology, English literature courses, and possibly even thinking about what a critical race theory reading of Jane Austen would look like in an academic sphere, which I think I mentioned it towards the end of my essay. And this is continue where your essay ends. I think for mine, it would be about thinking how our daily actions can further or hinder the empire project, and also to think about how the British Empire never actually ended. It became a different form. Similarly, how in America, for example, that legacy is still continuing today. So think about the prison system, the prison industrial complex, as an extension of plantation slavery, enslavement, and so on. In the UK context, we are living in the legacy of empire and colonialism through the school system, the whitewashed school system, through capitalism. The fact that capitalism exists is a extension of empire and colonialism. So I think we'll be thinking about stuff like that as an extension of my essay. So next time you do go to one of those National Trust sites and you've been given the tour, ask uncomfortable questions that make them sweat. So that's basically what I would tell people to do as for my essay. And if you are writers and thinkers, go and write your own essays as well, and get them out there.
Right.
And make people uncomfortable, especially people in powerful positions, the C leadership teams, the CEOs of large institutions, who are continuing to profit off the backs of Black and brown trauma. So I think that's basically where I'll tell people to go after my essay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. On that note, that brings us to the end of the panel. I really want to thank sincerely this panel for coming together today, making time to have this discussion and sharing it with everybody. I think it's a privilege to hear your thoughts, and thank you for making that contribution to the Austen spaces. And thank you to everyone for watching and for your interest in these topics. And I hope you take the time to seriously consider some of the ideas that were presented today. And I look forward to continuing the conversation on the internet. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you.